The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in plastic, a sound Chen had learned to tune out 8 months ago. She pushed through the staff entrance of Seattle General at 1824, her badge clipped to the pocket of scrubs worn soft from 100 washings, her movements economical and invisible, the way a person moves when she has learned not to take up space. The smell of antiseptic and stale coffee hung in the corridor like a permanent reminder that this was a place where hope came to be quantified in milliliters and milligrams. Her hands, when she pulled them from her jacket pockets, showed the faint white lines of old scars running across the knuckles, the kind of marks that came from work in places she did not talk about. She had been a competent nurse for 8 months. A quiet one. A forgettable one. That was the point. The ER was its usual Tuesday chaos, 3 traumas in Bay 4, a septic elderly patient in observation, a drunk who'd punched his own windshield 6 hours ago and was still trying to convince someone to let him drive home. Sarah moved between the stations with practiced efficiency, checking charts, adjusting lines, catching the small details that others missed. A patient's oxygen saturation drifting down 1% per hour. A medication interaction flagged in the system that nobody had read. The subtle signs that something was about to go wrong. She had always been good at seeing what was hidden. It was her gift. It was also, she suspected, the reason she was working night shift in Norfolk, Virginia, instead of doing anything else. At 1922, the ambulance doors burst open. The paramedic crew wheeled in a man in his 60s, his face flushed, his breathing labored and fast, his chest heaving against the oxygen mask like he was fighting the air itself. The intake sheet clipped to the stretcher read acute respiratory distress, complex medication history, recent hospitalization, and one line that made Sarah pause: patient is deaf, requires ASL communication for informed consent and symptom assessment. The man's eyes were wide with panic, his hands moving in sharp, precise motions even as the crew was transferring him to the bed, sign language. Conversation. Plea. Sarah knew what that looked like. She had seen it before, in a different context, in a place she had buried so deeply that some days it felt like another person's life. A nurse named Patricia was already at the bedside, taking vitals. Getting report, she called out, and Sarah moved toward the monitor station to begin the electronic admission. That was when the first doctor arrived. His name was Mitchell. Orthopedics, which made his appearance here even more puzzling, but he took one look at the intake sheet, saw the line about ASL communication, and said, "Not my case. Get someone from internal medicine." He was gone before Patricia could respond. The respiratory therapist came next, checked the oxygen saturation of 78%, looked at the communication line on the chart, and said, "You're going to need an interpreter. I can't do my job without knowing exactly what he's experiencing." She walked out. A resident appeared, read the chart, and told the attending, communication barriers. Liability concerns. We don't have staff trained for this. His attending nodded and reassigned him to another patient. Sarah watched it happen. She watched the cascade like a system failing at each checkpoint. A cardiologist appeared, looked at the EKG that Patricia had run, saw the patient's hand still moving in sign language, and said, "Insufficient resources. This patient requires specialist communication support we don't have." By 1941, 5 doctors had passed that bedside and said no. The patient's oxygen was dropping, 77 now, 76, and the panic in his eyes was becoming something else. Resignation. Betrayal. The look of a man realizing he was about to die in a hospital full of doctors who had decided he was too difficult to save. Patricia glanced at Sarah. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. The question was in that glance. Sarah was already moving. She pulled up the hospital's communication access list on the nearest computer. Seattle General had contracted ASL interpreters for exactly these situations. Cost them money, but they were there. She called the emergency line. "I need an interpreter at the ER bedside, respiratory distress patient, now." Not in 15 minutes. Now. The dispatcher asked if there was a code. Sarah said, "Patient cannot communicate with medical staff and is actively desaturating." code it as emergent communication barrier. The dispatcher, to her credit, called the interpreter directly. 10 minutes. They could have 10 minutes, maybe 12. But the patient could not wait 12 minutes. His oxygen was at 74 now. Sarah could hear the wheeze in his breathing, the struggle for air that had nothing to do with his lungs not working and everything to do with his lungs not getting the message from his brain fast enough. She approached the bedside, and before she did, she took one measured breath. The patient's eyes found hers. She held up her hands, flat, then placed them together and pulled them apart slowly. The universal sign for "I am sorry." His shoulders dropped. It was the smallest possible acknowledgement of recognition. The attending physician, Dr. Morris from emergency medicine, appeared and said, "We need specialists. Pulmonology. Possibly cardiothoracic. Get the intensivist consulted." Before he left, he added, "And we need to know if he has an advance directive. Someone find family." It was not a refusal. It was a delay dressed up as protocol. Then the chief arrived. Dr. Caldwell moved through the ER like a man who owned the walls. He was tall, grey at the temples, the kind of confidence that came from 40 years of being the smartest person in the room and never being forced to question it. His eye swept over the patient, the gasping man, the oxygen mask, the hand still moving in a language nobody here spoke, and then his gaze shifted. Down to the intake sheet. Down to the section listing previous duty stations. His eyes stopped there. Sarah, standing 6 feet away, watched his pupils dilate slightly. A microsecond of recognition. Then his expression went flat. "Who's the attending?" he asked. "Dr. Morris," Patricia said. "He's consulting specialists." Caldwell's jaw moved. "Page him. Tell him I want all non-essential staff cleared from Bay 3. Only the assigned team. Everyone else out." He turned to a nurse named Chen, not Sarah, a different Chen, though it was strange how the name had found him anyway, and said, "Contact medical records. I need this patient's full intake history pulled to my office. And flag it. This is a priority review." Sarah watched him study the chart one more time, his eyes moving across the patient's information with the intensity of someone looking for a specific detail. Looking for something that mattered more than the man's oxygen saturation, which was now at 71% and dropping toward dangerous. She did not move. She did not look away. She did one thing instead. She memorized the exact expression on Dr. Caldwell's face when he read the patient's previous deployment locations. She memorized it because she had seen that expression before. Not often. But once. It was the look of someone who recognized a threat and was calculating the best way to eliminate it. The interpreter arrived at 1934, 13 minutes after the call, and began signing to the patient in smooth, practice motions. But by then, 6 more doctors had passed that bedside and said no. 8 more, actually, if you counted the 2 surgical residents who had poked their heads in and immediately found reasons to be elsewhere. 15 doctors. Sarah counted each one. The next morning hit like a discipline. Sarah arrived at 0613 hours to find her name already on the unit board, not in the shift rotation column where it belonged, but in the incident log, printed and official under the header "Scope of Practice Violation." The charge nurse, Margaret, stood nearby pretending to organize supply cards, but her shoulders had gone rigid. 3 other nurses circled the break room entrance like sharks who'd caught a scent. Assisted patient with non-medical communication needs without authorization, the write-up read. Exceeded certified nursing scope. Potential liability exposure. Sarah read it once. Twice. Her hands didn't shake. She'd been written up before, once in 2009 by a lieutenant who caught her performing field triage on Marines outside her rotation. She knew the feeling, the slow burn, the deliberate documentation, the institution protecting itself by protecting the guilty. She folded the printout and placed it in her pocket, then walked to the break room. 3 nurses sat at the table, Janet from day shift, Rodriguez from ICU, and someone from pediatrics Sarah had never spoken to. All of them looked up when she entered. Sarah moved to the refrigerator, opened it, and retrieved her lunch container. She sat down at the far end of the table, opened the container, and began eating a sandwich that suddenly tasted like cardboard. Janet gathered her lunch bag first. Rodriguez followed. The pediatrics nurse waited exactly 2 seconds, a hesitation that meant she wanted to stay, that something in her recognized what was happening, then she stood and left without a word. The door swung shut. Sarah chewed. Swallowed. Took another bite. Her jaw moved with mechanical precision. One measured breath through her nose. The sandwich was half finished when Dr. Caldwell appeared in the doorway. He didn't knock. He never knocked. Sarah. My office. Not Nurse Chen. Not can you come with me. A statement. A command wrapped in the shape of 2 words. Sarah set down the sandwich, closed the container, and stood. The fluorescent light overhead hummed a single sustained note that seemed to track her across the room. Caldwell's office was on the 3rd floor. He walked ahead of her, his shoes striking the tile in a rhythm that reminded her of a marching cadence. Step, step, step. His shoulders moved with the kind of confidence that came from never being questioned, from 4 years of medical school followed by 23 years of never being wrong, or more accurately, never being held accountable when he was. The elevator rose. 72 floors. 247 meters of vertical distance, and Sarah counted every second of it because counting was better than thinking about the 15 doctors and the 1 doctor who had orchestrated the refusal, who had walked room to room with Marcus Webb's file in his hand and told everyone the same thing: communication barrier, liability risk, insufficient resources. She knew. She'd watched it happen. The office door closed behind her. Caldwell Saturday. He didn't gesture for Sarah to sit, so she stood. Standing was better. Standing meant she could leave faster. Effective immediately, you're being reassigned to permanent night shift, Caldwell said. His voice had the texture of a man accustomed to delivering sentences that ended careers. 3rd shift. 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Rotation begins Monday. Sarah's expression didn't change. Why? For the good of the department. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Sarah had been trained to read people in trauma situations, in dark rooms where the only light was muzzle flash and the only voice was the one screaming orders. She could read fear. She could read panic. She could read a man who had something to hide the way other people read a menu. Dr. Caldwell's eyes kept moving to the file on his desk, Marcus Webb's file. His thumb had started a habit, a small repetitive motion against his index finger, the kind of tell that said I'm lying and I know you know I'm lying and I can't stop myself from being obvious about it. His gaze had flicked to her twice, then away. His breathing had become shallow. His mouth had opened and closed once without sound, a rehearsal of words he decided not to speak. Sarah had seen men lie before. In Tikrit, in 2015, she'd watched a translator lie to a squad of Marines about a neighborhood's sympathies. She'd seen a commanding officer lie about ammunition counts. She'd seen patients lie about their pain medication to get more pills. The tells were always the same. The eyes darted. The hands betrayed. The voice took on that particular frequency of someone who'd decided the truth was dangerous. I've seen men lie before, Doctor, Sarah said. Her voice emerged quiet and steady, the kind of calm that comes from having survived things that would break other people. You all have the same tell. She turned and opened the door. Caldwell's face had gone the color of old parchment. He didn't call her back. He didn't speak. By the time his mouth worked again, she was already in the hallway, and the door was closing behind her, and the silence she left in that office was the kind that made people want to confess to things they'd forgotten they'd done. But Sarah wasn't thinking about silence. She was thinking about Marcus Webb in that corner room with minimal monitoring. She was thinking about what happens at 0300 hours on a night shift when there's only one nurse assigned to that wing and a patient has a medical emergency with no doctor willing to respond to the overhead page. She was thinking about the hospital protocol that said every code blue gets a response, but she was also thinking about the message that had been sent in the last 8 hours: don't help that patient, or you'll lose your job. The night shift began on Monday. Sarah reported at 2,147 hours and clocked in without speaking to anyone. She was assigned to the West Wing, not Marcus's usual location, which meant she wouldn't have direct access to him. The computer screen at the nurse's station glowed with patient names and vitals. 14 other patients on her roster. Marcus Webb was tucked into a corner room for doors down, monitored remotely from a station that covered 6 beds. Too many patients. Not enough eyes. Exactly as Caldwell had designed it. She worked through the evening in the particular silence of night shift, the kind of silence where the hospital becomes a different building, darker, emptier, more honest about what it truly is, a place where people either heal or they don't, where protocols can be circumvented and protocols can save lives, where the difference between those two things is often just one person who gives a damn at 3 in the morning. At 0251 hours, the monitor for Marcus Webb's room went flat. The monitor for Marcus Webb's room went flat at 0251 hours. No alarm. No escalation. Just the soft electronic whine of a machine announcing that nobody was watching anymore. Sarah heard it from the break room where she wasn't supposed to be, where night shift nurses learned not to be. The unit had skeleton crew tonight, 2 RNs for 23 beds, one of them calling in sick at midnight because that's what happened when your coworkers stopped speaking to you. The fluorescent lights above the break room table cast everything in a shade of institutional green that made even black coffee look suspicious. She moved before thinking. Not running, controlled pace, the kind that didn't announce itself. The corner room where Marcus Webb occupied a bed like a piece of forgotten furniture was dark except for the monitor's glow, and the glow showed her what she needed to see immediately: his chest wasn't moving. "Get me a light," she said to the unit secretary, but she was already reaching for the bedside lamp, already reading the room in that way trained people do when seconds matter. Marcus lay motionless, his left side exposed where someone, probably a day shift resident, had peeled back his gown during an assessment and never bothered to cover him again. His skin had the color of something that had stopped receiving oxygen approximately 4 minutes ago. The sucking wound wasn't visible at first. It was the smell that told her, copper and something else, something organic and wrong, the smell of a chest cavity that had stopped being sealed. She pulled his gown back, and there it was, a reopened laceration along his 5th intercostal space, the scar tissue from some ancient Tikrit injury giving way, the chest wall moving with the negative pressure of his lungs trying to inflate against collapsed airways. Air was hissing in through the wound with each attempted breath. No oxygen was getting anywhere except into the space between his ribs. "Call respiratory. Tell them to bring a kit to this room," Sarah said, but she was already moving, already reaching for the supply cart, already knowing respiratory wouldn't arrive in time. Ticking clock. ETA 3 minutes minimum. Marcus Webb had maybe 90 seconds before cardiac arrest became inevitable. Her hands knew what to do because her hands had done it before, in a place where the sun didn't set until August and the dust tasted like copper and death. She reached for his bedside table, the personal items shelf where his few possessions sat untouched since admission, and found what she needed, an MRE packet, the flameless heater still sealed. She tore open the outer wrapper with her teeth, a motion that felt like muscle memory reaching up from somewhere she'd spent 8 years burying. The plastic lining came free. She grabbed it, held it up to the light for 1 second to make sure it was intact, then pressed it directly over the sucking wound, her palm flat against his chest, feeling the desperate pull of negative pressure against her hand. The sensation was like touching a wound that wanted to swallow you. "Tape," she said, and the unit secretary, a young man named Derek who'd been ordered to avoid her by nurses who no longer acknowledged her by name, suddenly understood that this wasn't a request. He brought the trauma tape, the kind used on critical wounds, and Sarah positioned the plastic wrapper so that 3 of its 4 edges were sealed tight while the 4th edge remained slightly loose, creating a one-way valve. Air could escape when Marcus's lungs inflated, but nothing could get back in. A field dressing. A combat medic improvisation that had kept people alive in Fallujah when there was no surgical team and the nearest trauma center was 40 minutes of helicopter flight away. She smoothed the tape with her fingers, checking the seal, and Marcus's chest moved. Once. Twice. The hissing stopped. Get me a non-rebreather. 13 liters, Sarah said, and now her voice had changed, dropped half an octave, lost its apologetic contours, started sounding like someone who'd directed trauma teams under fire. Derek moved without hesitation. She fitted the mask over Marcus's face, watching his saturations climb on the monitor. 62. 68. 75. The numbers ascending like a count of heartbeats stretched across time. 82. 88. 91. 94. Stable. She kept one hand on his shoulder as the numbers plateaued, her palm pressed against his collarbone where she could feel his heartbeat stabilizing, could feel the difference between a man in extremis and a man who was going to survive the next 12 minutes. Her other hand was steady. Her breathing was steady. Everything about her in that moment was the opposite of everything that had happened during the previous 3 days, and she understood that the disguise had cracked, right there in front of a unit secretary and the ceiling-mounted cameras that recorded everything but told nobody anything important. The memory came anyway, unbidden. Tikrit, 2009, a marketplace blast that had caught a convoy of 3rd Platoon, Bravo Company, and she'd been the only combat medic in the vehicle when it rolled. Sergeant Valdez with shrapnel in his abdomen. Corporal Torres with a blast injury that had torn open his chest like someone had tried to split him with an axe. She'd been 24 years old and her hands had known exactly what to do, had improvised with Kevlar and duct tape, and the wrapping from an 4 kit had kept Valdez and Torres breathing long enough for the medevac to land, had held them together with exactly the kind of calm that made officers recommend her for commendation she'd accepted in silence. Respiratory just cleared. There, Derek stopped. He was staring at her hands, at the practiced precision with which she was now checking the tape seal on the MRE wrapper, at the casual authority radiating from her shoulders, at her posture that had transformed from deferential night shift nurse to something else entirely. The wound management, Sarah said quietly, speaking to Derek but understanding he might not have the medical background to recognize what had just happened. Combat trauma protocol. Open pneumothorax management. The terminology came out before she could edit it out, clinical and precise in a way that made Derek's eyes narrow. The plastic wrapper creates a one-way valve. Pressure equalizes on exhalation without allowing atmospheric air to re-enter the pleural space during inspiration. That wasn't how night shift nurses talked. That wasn't how someone who'd been systematically isolated and reassigned spoke. That was how someone spoke when they'd been trained to manage life or death situations under conditions where there was no backup, no protocol book, no time for second opinions. Sarah didn't wait for respiratory to arrive. She documented the vitals, the oxygen saturation climb, the intervention, her hands moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd filed incident reports at 3 a.m. in field hospitals where the electricity came from generators and the nearest trauma surgeon was a rotary wing flight away. She documented everything in perfect medical terminology while Derek watched her in a way that suggested he was seeing her clearly for the first time, and she knew with absolute certainty that by dawn, every staff member at Seattle General would know that the night shift nurse in the corner, the one they'd been ordered to ignore, had just done something remarkable. The one-way valve on Marcus Webb's chest rose and fell. Rose and fell. The rhythm of someone who was going to survive a night, which meant Sarah Chen had saved his life in defiance of a hospital system that had tried to let him die, in defiance of 15 doctors who had decided his deafness made him worth abandoning, in defiance of everything Dr. Caldwell had orchestrated to make sure nobody like her could interfere with whatever he was protecting by keeping Marcus invisible. And that was the moment everything changed, the moment a man in a security office somewhere saw the video of a night shift nurse performing an improvised chest seal with textbook precision, speaking military terminology, moving with authority that couldn't be faked. That was the moment the algorithm started flagging her name against databases she didn't know existed. 20 minutes after the monitor showed sinus rhythm, after Sarah's hand stopped moving and the room exhaled its collective relief, Dr. Caldwell walked through the door like a man who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. His eyes went straight to the computer terminal beside Marcus Webb's bed, the one where she'd documented his vitals, his ASL communication needs, the slow rebuild of his oxygen saturation from 68 to 94%. "Step away from that station," Caldwell said. "Not a request." Sarah turned. Her hands were still wet from washing the emergency supplies. The fluorescent overhead light caught the small blood smear she'd missed on her left wrist. She didn't reach for a paper towel. She just waited, one measured breath filling her lungs while her eyes held his. "You access classified military records," Caldwell continued, moving closer to the computer screen. His voice carried the precision of someone reading from a prepared script. "Patient files marked restricted. Duty station history. Combat deployment records. All pulled up on this terminal at 03 for 7 hours." Sarah said nothing. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, in, out, a sound that had nothing to do with the man standing 3 feet away from her, jaw tight, eyes bright with something that looked like triumph. "I never accessed those files," Sarah said. 8 words. "Clean. Flat. The log shows otherwise," Caldwell replied, turning the monitor toward her. The access timestamp glowed on the screen, 03 for 7 hours. Her badge number was right there. Except it wasn't her badge. The security system would show that too, if anyone cared to look deeper. But Caldwell wasn't asking her to look deeper. He was asking the room to believe him. "Your badge," he continued, "accessed those records at 03 for 7 hours. While you were standing right here. While your hands were literally performing an unauthorized medical procedure on a patient who should have been transferred to another facility hours ago." The thing about quiet dignity, Sarah had learned in 8 years of military service, was that it cost nothing to maintain when your spine was already forged in places Caldwell had only read about. She didn't argue. Didn't defend. Didn't make the mistake of talking louder. "I need your badge," Caldwell said, "and I need you to step away from this patient immediately." "He needs monitoring," Sarah said. "Chest wound is stable, but his respiratory status." "I'm aware of his status, Nurse Chen. The surgical team will take it from here." "You're done." The door opened before Sarah could respond. 2 security officers. Not the kind who worked the ground floor checking visitor IDs. These were the kind who escorted people out of buildings and made sure they didn't come back with questions about severance packages. Caldwell had made the call while standing in the doorway. While she was still documenting Marcus's vitals. The strategic efficiency of it landed like a punch to the sternum, not because Sarah didn't see it coming, but because now it was happening, and the calculations were shifting underneath her feet. Caldwell didn't care about the military records. He cared about something else entirely. Something Marcus Webb's mere presence in this hospital was threatening to expose. But she had no time to chase that thought. "I'm suspending you pending investigation for unauthorized access to classified patient information," Caldwell said, turning to walk away. "You'll be notified by HR regarding the terms of your suspension and the formal disciplinary hearing. Security will escort you off premises." One of the officers stepped forward, hand positioned at his belt, not aggressive, just ready. Sarah unclipped her badge without being asked and placed it on the bedside table next to Marcus's chart. The plastic was still warm from her body heat. Marcus's eyes were open. He was watching her. The oxygen mask covered the lower half of his face, but his eyes had that particular clarity that came from knowing he was seeing something he shouldn't, something that mattered, something that would matter more later. Sarah turned toward the window, toward the monitors, toward anywhere but the security officers' faces. That's when she saw it. On the bedside table. Partially hidden under the fold of Marcus's blanket. A single dog tag on a chain so old and battered the metal had gone the color of old pennies. The chain had broken in 2 places and been rewired together with what looked like field-grade paracord. She reached for it without thinking. One of the officers stepped closer. "Miss, we need to go now." The tag went into her scrub pocket. Not hidden. Not concealed. Just gone. The weight of it against her hip was barely 2 ounces, but it felt like holding evidence of a crime she hadn't committed and a truth she was about to prove. The walk out of Seattle General took 4 minutes. Through the corridor where orderlies were restocking supply carts. Past the nurses' station where 3 of her colleagues pretended not to see her flanked by security. Down the stairs because Caldwell had ordered the elevator locked to her level, another small strategic move, making sure she had time to feel every step of the descent. Out through the employee entrance where the rain had started falling sometime in the last hour, turning the parking garage into a cathedral of echoes and dripping water. Her car sat in space 47B, the same space she'd claimed on her first night shift 8 months ago. The engine turned over once, twice, then died with a sound like something inside had given up. She turned the key again. The battery had enough juice to light the dashboard but not enough to turn the starter. The engine wheezed and fell silent. Sarah rested her forehead against the steering wheel. The rain hammered the windshield in sheets, each drop hitting with the force of applause from an audience she could no longer see. The dog tag pressed against her ribs through the thin cotton of her scrubs, a weight that felt like both everything and nothing at the same time. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From restraint. From the 23 years of training that had taught her how to absorb punishment, how to accept orders she didn't believe in, how to walk out of rooms where she'd just saved a life and been called a criminal for doing it. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the sound her body made when it wanted to scream and her discipline wouldn't let it. She pulled the dog tag from her pocket and held it up to the grey light filtering through the windshield. 2 names were engraved on the metal. One old. One newer. Someone had scratched the newer name into the surface with what looked like the tip of a knife blade. The scratches were rough but legible, Chen, S-N-M-A-J. Sarah stared at it for exactly 7 seconds. Then she opened the car door and held the tag out over the parking garage floor, arm extended, ready to let it fall into the rain and concrete and oil stains and be done with it all. To be done with the person she used to be. To be done with the weight of the past catching up to the present. The dog tag hung there in the grey air. A single piece of metal that weighed nothing and everything. And then she heard it. Rotors. Far away. But getting closer. The sound of a helicopter cutting through rain-heavy sky, the kind of sound that meant somebody had been waiting for this moment. Waiting for her to save someone famous enough that their salvation would trigger notifications in databases she'd forgotten existed. Waiting for her to make one mistake or one perfect choice that would bring everything crashing down. She pulled her arm back inside the car and closed her fist around the tag. The rotors grew louder. The sound split the night sky above Norfolk like an axe through ice, and Sarah sat very still in the dark of her disabled car, holding a dead man's name in her hand, waiting for whoever was about to arrive to tell her who she really was. The rotors grew louder. The sound split the night sky above Norfolk like an axe through ice, and Sarah sat very still in the dark of her disabled car, holding a dead man's name in her hand, waiting for whoever was about to arrive to tell her who she really was. But the helicopter wasn't coming for her. At 1,400 hours the next afternoon, the Pentagon called Seattle General's main switchboard. Not email. Not a memo. A direct line from the Department of Defense Operations Center to the hospital administrator's office, and the woman who answered the phone went pale before she'd finished saying her own name. Marcus Webb's daughter had found the dog tag in Sarah's locker, returned by a sympathetic orderly who'd seen her escorted out by security, and when she'd turned it over in her palm, she'd read the name engraved on the back. Major Sarah Chen. Her father had told her stories about that name for 18 years. The medic who'd held his squad together in Tikrit when a building came down. The one who'd performed a field amputation on herself while still conscious so she could keep treating her unit. The one who'd collapsed from blood loss carrying a soldier twice her size to the extraction point. The one the Pentagon had never stopped looking for because what she'd done in that dusty compound, 4,847 lives saved across 3 deployments, existed in a file marked classified beyond top secret. The hospital administrator pulled Sarah's employment file for the investigation Dr. Caldwell had initiated. During the background check, a single line flagged in red, security clearance, level SCIETK, active status. The system ran the verification protocol automatically. Within 6 minutes, 3 federal databases confirmed the clearance was legitimate. Within 9 minutes, the call came through from the Pentagon. Within 12 minutes, the hospital's legal department was telling administration to stop the investigation immediately and produce every document related to Sarah Chen's suspension. A trembling night nurse who'd witnessed Dr. Caldwell's access log manipulation sat across from the hospital board and said what she'd been too afraid to say before. She'd seen him pull up the classified section of Marcus Webb's file. She'd watched him check the timestamp, 8:11 p.m. on the night of the respiratory crisis. Then she'd seen him log in from his own credentials at 8:52 p.m. and mark her badge entry as 8:53. She'd seen him do it. Her voice broke as she spoke, but she said every word, and the room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum above the table like accusers. Then the door opened. A man in dress blues walked in, no introduction, no announcement. His uniform bore the insignia of a Navy SEAL, but his chest was a garden of medals, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of weight that comes from having commanded men in places where mistakes meant caskets. "I coordinated with Major Chen's unit in Aleppo province during Operation Inherent Resolve," he said. "I've reviewed her service record. Major Chen has more confirmed combat saves than most trauma surgeons have successful routine procedures in their entire careers. She's a decorated officer. And someone in this hospital tried to frame her for accessing classified records to cover up his own negligence." He paused. "That's not going to happen on my watch." An FBI agent entered at 1,438 hours, flanked by 2 other federal officers carrying sealed documents. "We're investigating Dr. Sterling Caldwell for pattern obstruction of patient care and falsification of medical records," she announced, spreading documents across the table. "We've been monitoring his access logs for 3 weeks. This isn't the first veteran patient he's isolated. It's the 6th. We have evidence he altered records on 5 previous cases to conceal misdiagnoses. He wanted Marcus Webb gone because Major Chen's intervention exposed his failure to diagnose a perforated thoracic cavity before it became critical. He needed her off that floor before she filed a report." She looked directly at Caldwell. "You didn't just try to destroy a nurse. You tried to bury evidence of malpractice that cost people their lives." Dr. Caldwell's face drained like someone had opened a valve. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The competent, strategic administrator who'd carefully reassigned staff and manipulated schedules and built his case against Sarah piece by piece, that man was gone. What remained was someone drowning in air. "I was protecting the hospital," he said, and his voice cracked. "The liability, the federal requirements, He stopped. He looked around the table at the Navy SEAL, at the FBI agent, at the administrator whose jaw had locked into a position that suggested she was considering violence. I never intended." His hands were shaking now. His carefully pressed suit suddenly hung on him like he'd lost 30 pounds in 30 seconds. "You altered federal records," the FBI agent said flatly. "You falsified timestamps on a classified patient file. You obstructed emergency medical care to a retired military officer. And you're going to spend the next 5 to 10 years explaining that to people with significantly less patience than we have." The investigation he'd launched to destroy Sarah Chen had been the hammer that broke his own hands. 6 months later, Sarah returned to Seattle General to visit Marcus Webb for a follow-up appointment. She was moving easier now, the weight of suspension lifted, and she wore her scrubs like armor because that's what they were, the uniform of someone who'd finally stopped hiding. She walked through the lobby and saw him. Dr. Caldwell. Wearing a Navy security guard uniform with a name tag sewn slightly crooked, standing at the front desk checking visitor badges. His eyes found her face and he flinched as if she'd struck him. She didn't nod. She didn't acknowledge him at all. She just walked past, and she heard the badge clatter as his hand shook too much to hold it steady. Marcus Webb was waiting in the 4th-floor recovery ward, and his daughter stood when Sarah entered the room. Without speaking, Sarah reached into her pocket and withdrew the dog tag, no longer on a broken chain, but on a fresh cord, the metal polished so bright it caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. She placed it in Marcus's hand. He looked down at his name, then at her, and his fingers began to move in sign language. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," and his daughter smiled because she finally understood. Her father wasn't signing thank you to a nurse. He was signing it to the medic who'd saved his entire unit. The woman who'd chosen to stop being a soldier so she could save people without a gun, without orders, without the weight of military command. Who'd been willing to be invisible so that invisibility could be its own kind of strength. For the first time since Tikrit, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she belonged. In the weeks that followed, the hospital announced the formation of a Veterans Healthcare Advocacy Program, a dedicated team trained in ASL, combat trauma protocols, and the specific medical needs of retired service members. The position of director went through a formal selection process, but there was only one candidate who made sense. Sarah declined the title of chief. She wanted to stay in scrubs, wanted to be the person in the room when the crisis came, wanted her hands to be the ones that moved first. The administration accepted her decision because they'd learned something valuable. Respect isn't measured in titles. It's measured in what you do when nobody's watching and what you do when the whole world is. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind of discipline that comes from knowing exactly how much power you carry and choosing to hold it in reserve until the moment it matters most. Sarah Chen had spent 18 years hiding who she was, and in that hiding, she'd become something the world needed far more than another military officer. She'd become the person who said yes when everyone else said no. The person who stayed when everyone else left. The person who understood that true class isn't what you do when the lights are on and the cameras are watching. It's what you do when you're alone in a parking garage with a dead man's name in your hand, and you choose to show up for the next shift anyway. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your full story, like and subscribe. Comment below, what would you have done in Sarah's position? And if you know someone who's been fighting invisible battles, share this story. Because the quiet ones, they're often carrying more than we know.